Okay, it's a pleasure to share some Divrei Torah with you on this Erev Shabbos, Parshas Ekev. I'd like to actually dedicate today's Divrei Torah to the memory of a great leader of the Jewish people who died today, unfortunately, this morning in Israel, Rav Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. Rav Steinsaltz, as many of you know, was a great scholar and a sweet, caring, soft-spoken, humble man. If you've ever seen him speak, it just comes through almost immediately, just in his demeanor and his facial expression. He was the author of over 60 published books, the winner of the Israel Prize, the founder of a network of schools, and more. His crowning achievement, of course, was translating and vocalizing, annotating the entire Shas, the entire Talmud, a project that took him over 45 years, and which has actually made Torah accessible on the highest level to thousands and thousands of people around the world, including so many in our own shul, who now utilize the new Koren Steinsaltz Shas for Daf Yomi, but we're already using the Steinsaltz Talmud even before the Art Scroll came out so many years ago. According to the Times of Israel article from this morning, the origins of Rav Steinsaltz's connection to Gemara learning are fascinating. He was born in Yerushalayim in 1937 to a secular communist Israeli family. Though his father wasn't interested in religion, really, he sought out a tutor to teach his son Gemara, insisting that even though he was free to believe in whatever he wanted and not believe in God if he wanted, he said, quote, "No family member of mine will be an Am Haaretz." And so he later, continued to study Gemara, went on to religious high school, became a follower of Chabad Hasidus and of the Rebbe, and more. In one of his final interviews in 2016, just before he suffered the devastating stroke, which left him unable to speak for the last 4 years, he said, quote, "I never thought about what will be written on my tombstone. It doesn't really preoccupy me, but I am concerned by what will be remembered. I did something, but I didn't do enough. I didn't even do a fraction of the things I wanted to do. I wrote such and such books, very nice. I gave such and such lectures, very nice. I wrote articles like sand on the seashore. It's not enough. What would I have wanted to do? I would want to leave a small tree that will grow. I will tell you a final story," he continued. "In my garden years ago, I planted 2 cypress trees. One was stolen, and the other small cypress tree whose head was shorn off. I simply had mercy on it. I took its head and taped it to the still fresh trunk. I didn't do anything else. I let it grow. I hoped that the fissure would heal. Today, that cypress is almost 3 meters tall, a mighty tree. That's what I would have wanted to have done, to plant a small cypress, even one that was chopped, that will grow into a larger tree." What a beautiful idea, what a beautiful memory, and a beautiful quote. Rav Steinsaltz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, was not only a brilliant mind and a person of fine midot, but as you can see from this final interview of his life, he was a leader who had deep hope in the face of fear, and that is what I'd like to speak about in the drasha today, dedicated to his memory. According to Rav Steinsaltz in his book, Talks on the Parsha, Ekev is the primary parsha that focuses on the transition that the Jewish people would soon experience from the miraculous life in the desert filled with the overt presence of Hashem to the normal life in Israel, encapsulated by the pasuk, "Ve'amarta bilvavecha kochi ve'otzem yadi asali at ha'chayil hazeh, ve'zacharta Hashem Elokecha ki hu anoten lecha koach la'asot chayil." Moshe warns the Jewish people that they might come a day when they're so involved in working the land and in toiling and planting and seeing things grow that they'll think it's kochi ve'otzem yadi, it's their own ingenuity, it's their own strength that yielded all these positive results. But Moshe warns them, don't forget Hashem. That's a typical pasuk which Moshe reiterates many times in this parsha. Moshe warns them not just about the lure of idolatry, but perhaps even more importantly, about becoming haughty and overconfident and forgetting Hashem. He reminds them of the consequences of their human actions and endeavors in this world. Towards the beginning of our parsha, Moshe tells them about the wars that will inevitably come as they enter the land, and he stresses to them, Ki tomar bilvavecha, if you say one day in your heart, Rabim hagoyim ha'ele mimeni, echa ucha lo risham, there are great nations ahead of me, my enemies are huge, how will I ever overcome them? The next pasuk says, Lo tiramehem, if you have that feeling in your heart, if that feeling arises, Lo tiramehem, you should not be afraid of those nations. Zachor tizkor, you should surely remember, Et asher asa Hashem Elokecha leparo l'chol Mitzrayim, what Hashem did to Paro and all of Mitzrayim. When you left Egypt, God did great miracles. He vanquished all of your enemies, and He will do that for you again. Amazing two psukim. Ki tomar bilvavecha, if you have fear in your heart, lo tiramehem, you should not fear them. So many questions can be raised on this set of psukim. The Alshich, Moshe Alshich, the 16th century student of Yosef Karo, asks no less than 17 questions on these two psukim alone, including, I'll just give you a few examples. Why does the Torah introduce the mitzvah of not fearing our enemies, lo tiramehem, with this whole description and preamble about the fear that we might have in our hearts? Ki tomar bilvavecha, if you happen to come upon a circumstance where you might feel this in your heart, why the whole description about the reality of maybe feeling it in our heart? The Torah could have just come out and said, do not fear the nations, lo tiramehem. You don't need the preamble. Furthermore, if there's really a mitzvah of lo tiramehem, of not fearing them, then isn't it inappropriate for the preamble to say ki tomar bilvavecha, to acknowledge that we might feel fear going against this mitzvah? The Torah should have said, lo tomar bilvavecha, don't say in your heart, I'm afraid of them. In fact, lo tiramehem, don't have fear of them. It shouldn't have said, ki tomar bilvavecha, if you say in your heart. Number two, why isn't it enough to say, lo tiramehem? Why does the Torah have to remind us that Hashem did miracles in Egypt, zachor tizkor, asher asalach? Why you have to remember everything God did? Just say, lo tiramehem, don't be afraid of them. Number three, in reminding us of what happened in Egypt, why mention Paro and the Egyptians almost as separate entities? Number four, why does the Torah repeat the verb zachor twice? Zachor, tizkor, you should surely remember, and so on and so forth. 17 such questions. Aside from all these detailed questions which the Alshich and so many others ask about these two interesting psukim, I wonder, broadly speaking, what the message of the psukim is for us and what it could teach us about fear and faith. Rav Moshe Feinstein says that the psukim are trying to convey to us that we must reinforce our faith in Hashem. Many of us are believers, but that belief is sometimes limited to the intellectual and not something that we actually feel in our bones. Therefore, when other emotions like fear enter our orbit, they just take over. They push out the emotion that we might feel about our emunah, about our faith. The Torah is telling us that if the situation would arise, ki tomar bilvavecha, where you feel fear in your hearts because of the nations and the wars that you face, it's a sign that we need to work harder on inculcating within ourselves, not just intellectually our emunah, but our deepest faith in Hashem that we can actually feel emotionally as well. In a similar fashion, the Sas Emes points out that these psukim highlight how we as human beings live in this strange place between reality and faith. The first pasuk, Ki tomar bilvavecha, highlights for us that since we live in a natural world governed by the rules of nature, it is possible that we'll see our enemies and realize that b'derech hateva, in the natural way of the world, according to the natural order, there is no way we can defeat them, and we'll feel fear in our hearts. The second pasuk, lo tiramehem, zachor tizkor, reminds us that even though ki tomar bilvavecha, even though we live in a natural world, we're a people of faith who operate simultaneously in two dimensions, that we must increase our trust and faith in Hashem. Well, I certainly think that these answers are correct, and they do help to explain the plain pshat meaning of the psukim and the lessons behind them. I'd actually like to offer my own perspective on this set of psukim by sharing two thoughts that I have this week as I read the psukim and how they hit me. First, I think that the fact, as the Alshich points out, that the first descriptive pasuk, ki tomar bilvavecha, describing the fear that we might feel in our hearts, is unnecessary, and the Torah really could have gone straight to the mitzvah, lo tiramehem, not to be afraid of them. We can learn from the fact that the Torah did include that first pasuk, which describes our emotions, that the Torah was validating and confirming this very human reaction to danger. The Torah is telling us that it's likely that as human beings we will experience fear when facing danger, when facing any kind of life circumstance that seems beyond our control, that seems to threaten us in some way. And actually, the very fact that the Torah gives us a mitzvah, lo tiramehem, to counter that emotion is indicative of this as well. The Torah wouldn't need to command us lo tiramehem if human beings rarely would feel fear in those circumstances. What the Torah is trying to tell us is that we often face scary things in life, and it is okay, even as people of faith, even with deep emunah, it's okay to feel fear. Yes, we have to find a way to overcome that fear. And yes, we have to reinforce our faith in Hashem during those moments. But there is nothing shameful about that feeling itself. It's not a statement about our lack of faith. It's simply a human reaction, a natural, according to the Torah, human reaction to the dangers that we face. Secondly, I find it fascinating that the Torah here juxtaposes fear and memory. Yira and zachor tizkor. Lo tira, zachor tizkor. The dichotomy of these two things is instructive and I think can offer us an insight into how to overcome the fear that we might feel in these kinds of circumstances. As we face deep emotions like fear, which actually take over even our physiological response, induce fight or flight, and increased heart rate, and sweating, and shaking sometimes, all the different physiological responses that we have to the emotion of fear. The way to calm us down, perhaps, is to try to move from the right brain to the left brain, to try to move from emotion to fact. If you feel fear because of your enemies, says the Torah, zachor tizkor, use memory. Remember the history. Remember your experiences of the past. Remember the facts of the past. Remember your track record. You faced danger of enemies before, like in Egypt, and Hashem saved you. So there's every reason to imagine that this could be the outcome again now in the fear that you face as you look at your enemies head on. The very act of memory, the very act of bringing the intellect into the emotion, the very act of imagination and picturing past outcomes, past experiences, and inserting them into the current reality to imagine a positive outcome can sometimes be enough to take the edge off of our fear that we feel in the moment. It may not eliminate the fear, it may not get rid of that fear, but it might put it in enough of a context just to take the edge off and allow us to react perhaps in a calmer fashion. I find myself employing this kind of strategy so often lately. There's much uncertainty around us now about what the coming months and year will look like. I often feel fear and apprehension, as I'm sure many of you do, and I keep reminding myself of a couple of things. I keep reminding myself that in the distant past, people endured really tough times. The world endured really tough times and emerged relatively okay. I keep reminding myself that in the not so distant past, we have endured 6 months of this reality already, and an ever-changing reality. It gets worse, it gets better, and have more or less emerged okay. And for me, that memory, that use of memory, that intellect, that use of facts, that use of historical evidence, that ability to use the past to now imagine what this future outcome might be beyond this immediate moment of fear, helps me, I know, to take the edge off. While the psukim here of lo tira mehem, of not being afraid, of zachor tizkor, of remembering the positive outcomes of our past, were stated by Moshe Rabbeinu in the context of war, in the context of the fear of our enemies, I think the lesson that they inculcate within us is equally as applicable today to us who, Baruch Hashem, don't face enemies every day and don't face wars every day, but teach us that there is a juxtaposition between fear and memory, and that memory, although sometimes it can induce fear, memory can also be used as a tool to relieve the fear of the moment, to relieve the emotions that so overwhelm us and overtake us in the moment, and hopefully enable us to get past that moment and see a brighter future that is yet to come. I hope we can all utilize the lessons of the Torah, the lessons of Moshe Rabbeinu, to continue to strive for better outcomes, to continue to take the edge off of our emotions and our fears, and hopefully have a wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful week, a wonderful months ahead. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.